Cool. Looks like most folks who are going to be here are here. So let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Argo CD Rollouts community meeting. We've got a couple of topics today, so we'll dive right in. Let me make sure I've got a recording started. And looks like I do. Cool. Alexander, are you ready to present? Let's see, I saw you on the attendee list, but I don't see an Alexander in the list of participants. That's fine. They might show up later. We can go ahead and jump to mine and Ashutosh's presentation. Let me share my other screen. And I'll go ahead and say we're presenting a feature that we didn't write. We just helped to validate it as part of an Intuit internal sort of hackathon. Can y'all confirm you can still see it? I just went when I went full screen.
Yep. Yes, it's good.
Sweet,
yes.
Thank you. So we used a new feature, which will be in Argo CD 2.8 called ApplicationSet+plugin generator to enable declarative Argo rollouts configuration and deployment at Intuit. So this was primarily worked on by myself and Ashutosh. A couple other folks helped us test and validate it internally and work on docs. So thanks to Arman and Thiru for that help. So the goal is simply install the Argo rollouts controller on all of Intuit's clusters. And we have approaching 300 clusters and sort of our own internal system to manage all of those and keep track of what clusters we have and attributes around them. So using that information, we need to deploy the Argo rollouts controller, since a lot of our internal users will deploy their applications using rollouts. So I'll tell you about the old architecture, and then I'll hand it over to Ashutosh to talk about the changes that we made. So in the past, what we've done is used our internal control plane for clusters, which we call IKSM. It has an API that we develop and maintain internally. And we have a Jenkins job that every day calls that API and says, what are the clusters that are available? And what's some metadata about them? Based on the response, Jenkins creates directories in a Git repository where we deploy a lot of our Argo stuff from. And each of those directories is populated with a config file in JSON format with a lot of that cluster metadata. Then we have an application set configured with the Git files generator that loops over those directories and the files that are in them and uses the metadata from those files to generate applications, which we then sync to deploy the Argo rollouts controller to all of the clusters. So the application portion is new-ish. We also have a legacy process that we used that just deployed a static application directly to the cluster. So we have about 160 auto-generated applications and about 100 that just live on the cluster. They aren't even via GitOps. They just, the cluster where we host Argo CD is their only source of truth. So that's the old system, a little slow, a lot of steps involved. So now I'll turn it over to Ashutosh to explain what we switched to.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Michael. With the old architecture, we were facing few issues like when the new cluster was onboarded and customer want to use rollout, they have to wait for 24 hours. So we used a feature which was contributed by Max and Sebastian, and it's an awesome feature. So what we did, we built a plugin and which application set can directly then talk to the IKSM external data source, and then it would get the same data from IKSM, and then it will loop over and generate the rollout on the target cluster. Michael, can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
Yeah, so this is the plugin generator. So now with the plugin generator, you can bring your own plugins and you can write it in any language. It supports RPC or HTTP request. It can live in as a sidecar or it can be standalone deployment. In our case, we did a standalone deployment. It's a REST service running from where we fetch the cluster data. And yeah, you don't need to wait for your PR to get reviewed. So you can write your own plugin. You can also do a mix and match with matrix and merge generator. So yeah, Michael, can you go to the next slide? So this is the application set plugin config. So if you see, there's a plugin generator. In our case, it calls my plugin, and then config map. So we have all the the data in our config map, the endpoint of the API. So it would, in our case, is application set plugin IKSM, and then the token. So where application set connects to the endpoint, it requires the token to authenticate. So the token would live in the Argo CD cluster, and you to make a API call and get the cluster information. And then it would iterate through all the information which it get from the plugin, and then generate the rollout on the target cluster. Michael, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So what is the advantage of new solution? So first of all, like we saw benefit is our speed has increased when the new cluster is onboarded, and as Intuit is growing, we are onboarding a new cluster very often. So now instead of waiting, a user has to wait for entire 24 hours, they can have the Argo rollout installed in less than 2 hours. So again, that can be configurable. For now, we just set up as 2 hours. Maintenance, again, there is no manually created apps. It would be done through application set. Security was one primary thing. Jenkins was pushing some bunch of config files to the deployment repo, which we didn't like. That repo is pretty sensitive. And as application set get adopted by other teams, we don't want this deployment repo to be the files get pushed to this repos. Again, we wanted to validate the application set. Michael did an awesome job in reviewing that feature, and I think we got it merged. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much. Any questions? Probably you can answer. Michael, do we have any other slides for this?
I think that's the last slide. I do see a hand up, Christian.
Yeah, so does this potentially remove the need to like add generators in the future? So like the idea being is like if you need a specific generator, just like write one using the plugin method versus you know, spending the time to try to write it in tree.
Yeah, it does, which I think will be a huge win because a lot of folks want to add support for different SCMs. So with Argo CD core, like all we really have to support is Git, and everyone implements something that is Git compliant. But with SCMs, they have all kinds of different APIs, like they have different meanings of PRs, labels, tags, etc. And that's all knowledge that the core dev team either needs to learn or just trust and smash merge on the PR. So adding plugins lets us avoid having to know all that stuff and lets folks solve their own problems more quickly. Other questions? Cool. So this feature will be available in 2.8. If you have questions or excited about a particular use case for it, definitely reach out to me or to us. We'd love to hear about them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alexander.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining that meeting. Of course, it's only the second time I join one of these meetings, first time as a speaker. I'm going to talk about structuring directories in a GitHub repository. I wrote a blog post where I summarized ideas from the community and sort of combined them into one. And I wanted to share with you to get feedback and essentially help propagate these ideas among the community. So let me share. Okay, let me just ask, do you see the slide? Can you confirm? Okay, thanks, great. So just briefly about me, Aleksander Korzyński. I've held systems engineering roles since 2007, currently contractor, but representing my own views here, not any of the clients. Now, this is an idea I had. I'm really curious where people are from. I was going to do that for myself as well. So in the chat, when you Zoom name, if you could let me know, they're really great. All right, so agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of the art. So I've done some research on what people recommend when it comes to the directory structure, how you essentially where do you put the files in your GitHub repository, and I'm trying to combine them together. And the blog post is here. If you want to see it, I will post it maybe later in the chat as well. This is a short URL to the blog post. So here's the state of the art. So there are various authors have proposed different directory structures, but there is no established standard. And the current approach seems to be that different organizations create their own structures depending on their needs. But I see a bit of a problem with that because users, especially when they join a new organization, they need to learn the GitHub's directory structure at their organization. And I'm thinking that it would benefit the community if there was a standard that was, let's say, abstract enough and powerful enough to encapsulate the various use cases, the various needs that different organizations have. And this is a sort of attempt that I made at this based on the various ideas that people suggested. If it's not powerful enough, then of course it needs to be changed. So this is why I'm looking for feedback. But this is basically the problem statement here. I think such a structure, standard structure, would be something useful for the community. So I'm first going to talk about the approach by KOSTIS KAPELONIS. And this is the structure that he described in his article. So first of all, the recommendation is not to use branches to store information about different environments. This seems to be the standard in the community. KOSTIS makes a case in his blog article about it. So if you want to read the full argument, if you're not familiar with it, then you can find it there. But it boils down to saying that promoting from one environment to another is not just as simple as merging two branches together. So instead of keeping different environment data in different branches, there are different directories for different environments. And this is fairly standard. And since I'm talking here, I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. I'm pretty sure that people in this call already are familiar with many of these principles. But just as a recap in a sense. So what is here is a base directory. There are environments and there are variants. And variants is an interesting concept because these are what developers call mixins. So these are like classes that don't necessarily follow a hierarchy. So there is non-prod, which is one class. There is also EU, which is another class. And they are somewhat overlapping. They're not hierarchies. And if you want to promote something from one environment to another, you would copy the files from one of the directories in env from one, say from say QA to prod EU, right? But you wouldn't copy the stuff in variants. So anything that isn't supposed to be promoted goes to variants. As an example, replica count. You don't normally copy the replica count configuration between environments. It's specific, tightly tied to an environment. So you keep it in a separate directory. So that's what variants are for. And environments is what you can copy. Now, ODED and OZER also propose an approach. This is primarily for infrastructure as code repositories. There's an idea here to use a workspace directory, which you will find at the very bottom. And the workspace directory is meant to attract a user, because this is one of the problems I'm trying to solve. Okay, so a new developer starts at the company, or actually a different use case. Somebody introduces GitOps into an organization, and everybody's new to it, right? So where are they supposed to make the changes? This is a common question. And like, what is this structure? Like, well, what are all these things? Where do I make my change? So the name workspace, I like that because it's meant to attract the user. So in this structure, a developer makes change to the workspace, which has a list of components, component A, B, and C, which could be applications, but could be other things. And there is a separate file that defines, okay, if it goes to workspace, it's supposed to get deployed, say, to staging. Then from staging, it's supposed to get deployed to, say, well, that was actually wrong order. But let's say it's supposed to first go to dev, then supposed to go to staging, and then it's supposed to go to prod. So there's a file that describes this pattern of deploying, for promoting from one environment to another. But you start with workspace. You always start with workspace here. And there's also some automation around this, a project called Telefonistka, which creates PRs that promote from one environment to another. So that is, again, a similar concept, similar ideas, but there's this this addition of this workspace idea that's meant to attract users. Now, Christian, who's in the call, and I haven't met you, Christian, by the way. We need to meet someday. I really enjoyed reading your articles as the other ones that I'm citing in the article. Here's a structure. And correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, Christian, if you're here. So this is one of the structures that Christian suggested in his article. And this one combines infrastructure as code with applications, right? So you don't necessarily have to keep them in one, right? You could split them, but this particular case, we put them together. So apps go to the apps directory. And again, we have these different directories per application. We have the base. So there's a separate base here per application, and there are overlays, right? This works really well with customize. So you have an overlay for dev, prod, and stage. And of course, with customize, you can then say, oh, in your overlay, define you want a specific, say, image to be deployed. Whereas in your base, you keep everything that's common. So that's briefly the idea. So how is what I'm suggesting different? It really, there isn't much. I don't think there really is innovation here. It's really just combining these ideas together. So let's go at the top level. And I'm kind of basing this on what I've seen at other enterprises that I've been sort of contracting to. There are different organizations. So there are product teams. There's an infrastructure organization, and they tend to have maybe different policies, maybe for approval. So if we are going with the monorepo approach, and this is what I'm suggesting here, at the top level, I'm suggesting having different directories for the organizations. So maybe product teams. Every product team has the applications. So this is the top level. It's kind of simple. So what goes to an application? And here's where I'm sort of trying to take this idea further, the ideas further that I saw, which is, okay, so I like the idea of a workspace. So let's say there's a workspace. Now, I've made it plural here because I actually believe that in a normal flow, developer flow, you don't always start with, say, the dev environment. Sometimes you discover a problem, say, in the staging environment. You want to actually fix it in staging. And then maybe port these changes back to dev, but you want to start in staging. So in my case, there are workspace, and I'll show later what that means. And there are unpromotables. And these are kind of similar to variants, but I'm going to describe that later. So I'll start with workspaces, because that's where a developer normally starts. And I have these different environments here. So prod, QA, staging, right? This is fairly standard, as expected. Now, what do I have inside? And there are a couple of ideas here. So one is, first, I have multiple files. By the way, I've been, I mean, it's a good moment to mention this. I've been designing this with Helm in mind. So these ideas are well tested and well fitting if you're using Helm. For Customize, I haven't really created a working implementation. I believe this still can be applied to Customize. I just haven't figured out all the details. But for Helm, I suggest multiple files here. So say image version, base version, settings. Settings where you keep most of the stuff. Image version where you say keep the tag of the application image. And base version where you keep like a pointer to a Git repository and a Git ref that points to the location of the base template. So what I wanted to achieve here is to have shared base templates. So not to have a copy in different application, but have them in a different repo. And then in the GitOps repo, you just refer to a specific Git ref in the Git repo in the of the templates. So let me just show you briefly what that might look like. This is an implementation that's really tailored to Helm, but this Customize this YAML may look a little different, but this is an image version, right? And the idea here is this is all it contains. Why is it so simple? Because one of the problems that you often have is, well, you want to update a tag automatically. And one of the problems that you often have, okay, how do you do it? You have to parse your YAML file. If you parse your YAML file, the order may change of the other data in the YAML file. So maybe you don't use a parses. Maybe you just use a regular expressions substitution and just, look for the tag name and replace it. You can, but that's ugly. So the idea here is I have this very short file. If I want to automatically update this tag, I literally generate a whole new file like this, and I overwrite this one because this is only 2 lines. I can just overwrite it, and it's only the tag. So this helps with automated updating of tags. This is why it's a short file. With base version, again, this is so like I mentioned, this is for Helm. The idea here is, okay, I say I want a specific chart. The name of the chart is actually defined in the settings file, but in this base version, I say this is the version of the Helm chart I want. This is a ref in the Git repo where this chart is stored. It will actually require a completely separate talk to discuss this in more detail, how this works, because this works. This is not, let's say, something that is available with Helm right away. But let's abstract away from Helm a little bit. The idea here is whether you use Customize, Helm, or anything else, that you have a file where you define, I want the base from a given Git repository or at a given ref. So this could be a tag, this could be typically, I would suggest a tag that doesn't move or a Git SHA, right? But not something that moves like a branch, unless you're just experimenting. So how do you promote a release between environments? In a very simple way, all you do is run these 3 commands. So you remove, let's say, staging. You want to promote from QA to staging. So remove staging, you copy from QA to staging, and then you add it again. So that's where everything that was in staging is gone, all the files, and then you add it. And everything that was in QA is now in staging. So that's what the promotion looks like. So now somebody may ask, okay, so what do we do about things that cannot be promoted, like I mentioned? So that's what unpromotables is for. Actually, before I talk about unpromotables, just a brief mention. If you have multiple regions, what I suggest is you create more directories inside workspaces, not subdirectories, because then promotion is going to be too complicated. And I suggest the @ character as a separator, because that way it kind of stands out, even if you have dashes or underscores in the sort of, let's say, your environment classes like EUS2. So this way you have the different workspaces for different regions and different environments. But unpromotables, this is what I wanted to talk about, because that's very much the same idea as variants I discussed previously, but it's specifically called out. This is the stuff that you cannot promote. So anything like a replica count, as an example, or horizontal pulled out auto scaling, things that is tightly, let's say, very specific to a given environment goes here. And in here, you can have subdirectories. That's not a problem. This is, in fact, it's easier that way because you can have a file inside prod, you can have a file inside US West, and you can have some setting that's common to all of prod, some setting that's common to a region. There's no problem. I probably would say we shouldn't have too many layers of subdirectories. So if you need another layer, I would just say use the @ character, because the developer experience may actually suffer if you create too many layers. So non-PCI is an example. Like if you're a regulated business and you process payment card information, you may keep that in a separate cluster, and you may have a non-PCI cluster for stuff that doesn't process payment card information, and a PCI cluster for everything else. So, so you may have essentially a separate cluster called EUS2 non-PCI. So I would suggest you don't create too many levels. You just add character, but in a sense, you can if you want to have multiple levels. If you want to deploy to multiple namespaces at once, rare case, but can happen with some infrastructure level applications. Again, I suggest multiple sort of directories here. The idea is that you can also have mixins here. So at the bottom, you see the any thing. So this directory very strictly defines, hey, these are going to be mixins. So everything that's EUS2 is defined in the EUS2 directory. So that's the idea of unpromotables. And none of this stuff gets promoted, just environment specific, the configuration. So now we are kind of zooming out, and I'm nearing the end of the talk. So this is the entire application directory, sort of at the bird's eye view. I assume this is, say, some sort of management cluster that you may also have. So so this is why it's EUS2 at management. Again, you have unpromotables, you have workspaces. Workspaces is a flat structure. You no longer have any subdirectories. Unpromotables you can have if you want to. And then the entire directory structure with different orgs, it just looks like this. And this is when we kind of zoom out to the very top. So that's it. That was my case. This is what I wanted to share. And I'd like to move on to Q&A. And I wanted to ask you, if this was intriguing, if you find that there was something that you could apply from this, then I would be curious also to find out. If you have any other questions, comments, suggestions how this can be improved, that would be great. So let me know. I can see there are some questions in the chat, and when I'm sharing, my chat is by default closed. Let me actually open that. It's going to be easier.
Dennis has his hand up. Yeah, I think chat didn't have any questions. We were just sharing links back and forth, but Dennis.
Right, great. Thanks.
Hi. Sorry, hi. By the way, Michael, it's Denis, not Dennis. That's fine. No worries. Right, so I have a lot to comment here. So I'm going to try and make it as short and sweet as possible. So first thing is, I think having a or more than one standard directory organization is a very noble goal. That being said, I don't think a single one can cover all use cases. There's different requirements in different places. One aspect I didn't hear about it in your proposal was security considerations, for example, and security requirements considerations. For example, the company I work for, which is Sony PlayStation, we have a very paranoid security group, and they enforce we work in certain ways, which translates differently depending on what we're working on, right? But for example, we have, I don't know, 30, 40 clusters and ramping up very quickly right now. They're massive clusters, and they're very complicated clusters, as in they're hybrid, cloud, bare metal, and even the bare metal runs your regular servers, and some of the hardware is not your usual hardware. And I'm going to leave it at that. I can't talk about it. And some of these clusters are accessible to some of the personals, some of these clusters will not. And we need to, for practical reasons, we need to put them in different directories at the top of the monorepo, because we do use monorepo. So yes, I agree with the fact that monorepo is the right way to go. I agree with the fact it took us months to figure out and discuss a proper structure for our monorepo. We also agreed that, well, not everybody did, but most of us did, that branches were obfuscating too much to be workable practically. But we couldn't use the structure you propose for practical reasons, because we use code owners to separate some parts of the repo and separated from other parts. We have multiple teams with different levels of access to the monorepo. And another thing we do is each team gets access to a certain number of namespaces in various clusters, not always the same namespaces in all the clusters. And they are not allowed to deploy to other namespaces, and we manage that with our back. And we also have, we use GitLab as a Git host. And we also have a mandatory MR, sorry, it's called MR in GitLab. And the pipeline actually supplements the code owner stuff and then provides more barriers to accessing other parts of the monorepo. So again, I think, and what I want to comment is like based on your structure, ours is mostly reverted in parts. It's like you know, it's more like bottom up or top down, depending on how you look at yours. So again, my point here was that rather than a standard, I would prefer that we have a set of maybe examples or recommended structures or something like that, because one is certainly not going to cover all use cases. And it doesn't cover ours, and I'm sure we're not the only company and that have different requirements, and not even our structure would cover theirs. And I think we need more than one recommended structure.
Got it. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I'll just briefly respond because I see there are two people with their hand up. We've also found that, for example, code owners in GitHub has not been sufficient for, let's say, restricting access to different directories. So we would need to use either one of the, let's say, third-party extensions or develop our own. And we're probably going to go towards the last option, which is develop our own method for essentially deciding who can modify what, because code owners, yes, was too limited in that extent. So I totally understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we do is we still use code owners, and it's used for the UI, and it kind of does a kind of rough, how do you say it? Blocking of barriers to committing, but the actual authorization to access a part of the monorepo is done by a GitLab pipeline. So we have mandatory MRs to commit to the monorepo, and every time you submit an MR, a pipeline is automatically triggered. And there's various jobs that say, okay, this is valid, this is valid. No, you can't here, or you need approval from there. So and that happens using the GitLab UI. So you submit the GitLab UI. So we use the GitLab UI for gathering the approvals, and then when the pipeline executes, we check who provided an approval, what team they're from, and what their approval can cover out of the changes in that MR. And often there needs more than one approval.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
There's more than that. Maybe our use case could be a good presentation too, if I get clear.
Okay, cool. Yeah, definitely. All right. So I think Kristen, you were first. Your hands up.
Yeah. And I'll try to be succinct as Denis. Hopefully I said that right. Said, but I kind of want to echo what he said. It is when I first started out writing about like directory structures and GitOps directory structures, I had the same goal as you did, and then quickly found out that there isn't one for all, or there and I actually wrote in the blog, like you end up running into Conway's law a lot, where you try to set up a directory structure for someone, like, as you know, when I was at Red Hat, as I was working with our customers, trying to find one that fit all, you would run into issues because their communication structure just wouldn't allow for the one we were proposing. So we would have to change it up. And so I think focusing the conversation more on best practices versus like trying to templatize someone, right? So like kind of what and I read in KOSTIS's blog post, right? It's like, don't use branches, right? Use directory structures. Like that's the kind of stuff I think is more useful. Or like, what do you call it? like case studies. Like this presentation you had, like kind of felt like a case study a little bit more than anything else, which a lot of people are gonna like read it and like pick parts of it that fits into their own workflow. So in general, I found the unpromotables thing very interesting. Like I never thought about that aspect of it. So like that's kind of like something, you know, posting something like this is great because it kind of gives me ideas, and like others, I'm pretty sure it'll give them ideas. But just I guess that's the only feedback I have, is that trying to go with a one size fits all, it's just hard, right? It's just I think a lot of us have been down that path, not just, you know, not just myself, not just others, but I think like a lot of us have tried to go down that path. Even when like using Flux, right? Like Flux is kind of it'll give you a directory structure, but it's very, very loose, right? Like you can do a lot with it. You can change it up. You don't have to like use their proposed ones out of the box. So yeah, that's kind of it. I don't think there's one to rule them all. I think really it's very specific, and it's very not only to the use cases, just kind of the organization, like, you know, Conway's the organization's communication structure may not allow for a lot of the things that you propose. So that's just kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks. Luke.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation for sure, and the discussion. I think kind of like Christian's comments, where this is a great kind of place to facilitate more discussions in these designs. I was thinking about another one of KOSTIS's blog posts, and I think like Michael's talked about this as well. We're taking what you've put together here and using like Helm as the example, where would you have the same structure, or would this be a reason to bring in branches when you want to say render all of your templates, render like all of your charts, and commit that back into the repo? And would you then like want to do that in the same folder structure or something like that? Because I have a lot of use cases kind of similar to I think some others have talked about, like, oh, we need to render the charts out or something and commit that back in on the see the diff, but also just managing things that way.
Yeah, so the approach here is that the rendered manifests live in a separate repo. So there is this repo for that developers interface with. That's where change is made. And then on a PR, the manifests are rendered and are committed in a different repo. When you merge the repo, when developer merges the repo where they made the change, automatically the other PR will also get merged. So yes, pre-rendering is something that has been taken into consideration here. It has its pros and cons, of course, which is probably a wider subject on its own. But yeah, that's the approach. That's the approach here. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that helps. I was just going to also make a tongue-in-cheek comment that some of the discussions feel like the debates of Git flow, whether to do that versus flat structure stuff. But
yeah,
again,
very much so. You know, and the Git flow was a very good invention at the time, and I think it still is. I think I did read in some of the blog posts also some really good case why it doesn't apply here. Why you know, Git flow introduced the idea, hey, you know, use different branches for different environments, right? And we are not using that here, and there are good reasons why, right? It's just maybe it isn't need for code, for application code. When you promote something, you promote everything, and that's just why merge works much better there. I think that's the main difference there. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Sweet. Thank you, Alexander. Other questions for Alexander, for me and Ashtosh in general, or new topics? If not, we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll see you at the next one.
Okay, that's all right.
You can go ahead, Hong, if you want.
I want to take a small opportunity since we have seems a lot of subject matter expert here asking a question. We do get this question every now and then about the Helm, the native support for the Helm. I want to see your guys' opinion about those hooks and what's the other functionality they have? They have this how do they can query for the live data to do something when you're using the Helm, like those functionality. I want to see you guys' opinion about those things is in general. Do you get the lookup? Yes, the lookup. Do you guys thinking that kind of like, oh, I'm dying for it because I really want to have it? Or do you guys thinking because GitOps is kind of like you wanted more practice in the pure GitOps, you want the source of truth actually more in the Git rather than you have some like runtime information which like could be keep changing. I'm not sure someone wants to share their opinion based on their practice there.
Yeah, I mean, I could start. So we're not using that mainly because we are pre-rendering the manifest. But I assume that I would say for an organization that doesn't need to pre-render them, lookup is great. And I think it's a lot easier to set up as well than all this complexity with having to pre-render the manifest. So I think it's very useful for someone who wants to get started with Argo quickly. But I think the bigger you grow as an organization, the more you want to move these rendering to Git and then also the comparison to Git. And so this is my take on this.
Yeah, go ahead, Denise. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're pretty happy with Helm being only used for rendering charts in Argo CD and leaving it at that. The idea being we want to leverage as much as possible from Git because the big advantages with Git are that it's self-documented and self-historied. And if Helm starts messing with that, it's just makes things more complicated to track. So we're just happy to have Helm just used for rendering charts, and that's it.
Cool. Anyone have? I mean, it seems that people are. If I'm summarized based on what you guys saying, that means it's the general knowledge is when you go to more bigger production, when you're using these things more seriously, it seems that you don't want to use that functionality because you want it to be more declarative, more like a source of truth in the Git. But I want to see whether anyone else has a different opinion about you think it should be the other way around.
So what I like about the Helm lookup is that you can stamp out generic GitOps repositories that potentially, right? So like I have an application I want to deploy and I want to deploy it to like, I don't know, 50 clusters, for example. And, you know, all of them are generally the same except for, you know, a few things. The most common use case is like the ingress host name that another application on the cluster may or may not need, right? So instead of having an overlay for each one of those clusters and deploying that overlay, I just have kind of like one generic deployment and then use the lookup feature to then populate things that I need for that application. Other than that, I'm not sure. I don't know what other use cases are there for the lookup that makes that useful, but I think for me, the big one, I think, is being able to like rubber stamp, you know, a lot of clusters. And if they are kind of like treating clusters as cattle, right? Like I'm just deploying a bunch of clusters, deploying my workload, and then kind of use some of those features like lookup to then populate things that I may need. So that's kind of, I think it's useful in that regard.
Okay.
Considering the use case you were talking about, which is you want clusters that mirror each other, but not completely, or you know, parts of it are the same and parts of it are not. We have a feature that we use here, which we call, we haven't settled on a real name, but cluster links or whatever you want to call it, and where we can use a YAML file that's picked up by an application set, and it's adjacent to where would be the directory with your whole Helm chart. And when the application set finds that YAML file, it will copy the app from the cluster that's in the YAML file, and just like replicate it entirely, except the values of YAML will be picked up for that particular cluster. And we can do that at the application level. We can do that at the namespace level, and we can do that at the entire cluster level. And the other thing I wanted to say is that we can point to either actual cluster, but we also have like virtual clusters, which are like the same organization as a real cluster, but the only difference is they're not deployed anywhere. They're just there to be used as a kind of a framework type of clusters, and you can copy an entire namespace from there in your cluster and done. And so when you update that source cluster, it updates all the clusters that point to it. There's a bug for that, and I have a PR that should be, in 2.8. I mean, it's been merged in master to actually make that work better, because there was a bug associated to that. So it'll work completely in 2.8.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just want to get some idea, but thank you for you guys sharing. So I think that's concluded for now.
And Hong, we do have two different attempts to get lookup-like features in Argo CD. One requires an upstream Helm change, which seems to have stalled, but there was some action about a month ago. The other is a proposal from Jan to introduce dynamic parameters to Argo CD. And Jan and I have slight disagreements about the implementation, but I think overall the idea is a good one. So if you want to hop in and leave your thoughts on that proposal, that would be helpful. I personally like the idea of keeping that feature close to Helm, because people who have already written lookups can take advantage of those lookups today. I like avoiding having Argo CD specific features when something else exists.
Right.
But if we can make it work for plugins, for customize, I think it could be pretty handy in Argo CD.
Sounds good. I will take a look. Thank you.
Yep. Cool. With 10 minutes left, anyone else have any topics or thoughts or questions? Sweet. Thanks all for coming. See you next time.